What's going on, guys? We are back here with another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where we take a look at the Magic Online challenges for Modern, Pioneer, and Standard, respectively. We take a look at the metagame, see what everybody played in the top 32s of these challenges, and at the very end of each format, we take a look and see if we can find some sugar, some spice, or perhaps just anything nice. Before we continue and get started in today's video, I just wanted to say we are getting very, very close to 20,000 subscribers on YouTube. That would be a great milestone to achieve, and I know a lot of you watching out there. I check the analytics. I'm looking at you. I know you're not subscribed, if you're not. So go ahead and click that subscribe button and let me know in the comment section what you guys think of this series. I know that I've had a lot of people come up to me and say that they watch these every week, so I hear you out there, all right? So thank you for watching, and with all of that out of the way, let us get started, as we always do with the Modern format. And it looks pretty good. Modern has been one of the more diverse formats over the past couple of months at this point, especially through the troubling Cori-steel cutter times in Standard. As you can see, 7 different decks won the 7 challenges over the course of the weekend. I can't even remember the last time that's happened over the course of this series. It's crazy. Amulet, Boros, Broodschale, Dimir, Esper Goryo's, Grixis Shadow, Orzhov Blink, plenty of different viable archetypes. Boros Energy. A lot of people like to say that Boros has a chokehold on the format. I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, a deck that is ranging and sort of fluctuating from 14 to 16% of a given metagame, yeah, I mean, it's a reasonable share, but I wouldn't necessarily say that you're going to play against Boros like on average 4 to 5 times in a given tournament, which is what it was like with Standard and things like Cori-steel cutter. So definitely not on that sort of level of dominance or previous decks in Modern's past. The reason people like it so much is because it is the most well-rounded deck in the format. It has very aggressive draws, it has a ton of card advantage, it has good removal. It's just a Jund deck at the end of the day. It's like a slightly more aggressive Jund deck. Domain Zoo clocking in at 6.7%, which is a little bit down from last week's 8%. Birdscale up slightly from 5.8 to 8.8%, I can speak. Orzhov Blink, a little bit of an uptick there, 2.7 to 6.3. And if we take a look at Esper Blink, 5.8 last week, 2.2 this week. So it seems like there was a period of time where people were kind of gravitating more towards the Esper version of Blink with Psychic Frog. Now it seems like those people have moved back towards the standard Orzhov version, as we see an Orzhov version did win one of the challenges. Other than that, it's Modern. The rest of these numbers aren't changing a ton here. Slight uptick in Azorius Control, slight uptick in Ruby Storm, but nothing else too crazy that's like, we need to talk about this. So that is what I have for the metagame. Let's take a look and see if we can find some interesting deck lists scattered within this top 32s. We featured him last week, and he keeps coming up with banger deck lists. Young Dingo, popular Twitch streamer and content creator, the one and only, won a Modern challenge over the weekend with this Grixis Shadow deck list. And it's a Grixis Shadow deck list. I mean, a lot of these cards make sense, right? 4 Mishra's Bauble to pair with 4 Dragon's Rage Channeler. You have your other 1-mana threats in the form of Death Shadow and Nethergoyf. Couple Psychic Frogs. Interesting to see only 3 copies of Frog. And then you have removal, Fatal Push, Lightning Bolt, interaction in the form of Stubborn Denial, 4 Thoughtseize, 4 Expressive, just a very clean deck list, along with 3 Cecil Dark Knight. And what's really cool about Cecil is it sort of gives you, not quite in the same way as Death Shadow does, but it gives you another benefit and another payoff to losing or paying a bunch of life, where if you Fetch Shock Thoughtseize, attack with Cecil, you can just flip Cecil on turn 2 sometimes. So that is pretty cool that it gives you like this sort of Death Shadow 5, 6, and 7 in a weird way, combined with all of these other just very powerful and potent threats. Psychic Frog, Nethergoyf, Channeler, and Shadow itself. Good interaction. Sideboard, you got additional threats in the form of Ragavan. Just a very well-rounded deck list, and yeah, looks like Cecil is here to stay in Modern. Next up here from user Xenowan, 6th place in a challenge over the weekend. I've seen a couple of these lists starting to pop up and float around recently, and I wasn't necessarily sure exactly how viable they were, but Xenowan put up a challenge top 8 with it. So let's talk about sort of the concept of this deck, where the whole the whole archetype is really built around this card that you see in front of you, Birthing Ritual, which is a 2-mana enchantment. It sort of has this weird birthing pod style thing where you do it in your end phase, but you don't have to activate it. It's just a triggered ability that happens. But you end step, you can look at 7 cards, top 7 of your library. Then you may sacrifice a creature. If you do, you can put a creature with mana value X or less from those cards, where X is 1 plus the sacrificed creature's mana value. So, for example, if you have, say, a Coiling Oracle or an Icefang Coatl, both of which replace themselves when they enter the battlefield. Coatl is a 2-mana 1/1 flyer that draws a card. Coiling Oracle is a 2-mana 1/1. Reveal the top card. If it's a land, put it into play. If it's not, put it into your hand. So you've already gotten your value out of these cards when you play them, and you can sacrifice them to Birthing Ritual to go find a 3-drop. And it just so happens that there are some powerful 3-drops to Birthing Ritual into. Abhorrent Oculus is very good because you get to sort of you get to bypass the cost restriction because you're just putting it directly into play. You're not casting it. So you get a 5/5 flyer that's going to make a 2/2 on their turn. You can get copies of Harbinger of the Seas. You can get stuff like Endurance to mess with their graveyard. You can get a cheap flyer in the form of Brazen Borrower. And that's really all the deck is, just a bunch of good value 2-drops and then powerful 3-drops to hit. Floodpits Drowner buys you a little bit of time and tempo, can act as like a pseudo removal spell for a turn. You have Fibblethip, which replaces itself. And then on top of all that, you have Shardless Agent, which can not only just hit Birthing Ritual, but if you just hit, say, an Icefang or a Coiling Oracle, you're digging yourself and getting deeper into your deck to find the Birthing Ritual eventually. And then on top of all of that, you just have a bunch of good free interaction like Flare of Denial and Force of Negation. Yeah, pretty interesting looking deck list. If you're a fan of the Neoform stuff and you maybe you don't want to go quite as all in as those Neo brand like Galta, Gristlebrand versions, this is a nice little happy medium, I think. Let us go and take a look at the graveyard here with True Heroes 30th place deck list featuring Sin Spira's Punishment in sort of this new style, new take on Goryo's Vengeance. So the idea here is fairly straightforward. It is get large creature into the graveyard and cast Goryo's Vengeance. So we have a couple of different large creatures. We have Atraxa Grand Unifier, also known as Sephiroth the Savior, and Sin Spira's Punishment. This is kind of a weird one, so I'm going to read this one. It's a 7/7 flyer for 7, and it says, whenever it enters or attacks, you exile a permanent card from your graveyard at random, then create a tap token that's a copy of that card. If it's a land, repeat the process. If you have... there's actually not a lot of permanents that go to the graveyard besides the lands. Maybe Emperor of Bones got killed or discarded early. So what's really cool about that is if you say Goryo's into a Sin and you only have lands and an Atraxa in your graveyard, then the Sin, normally when you Goryo's the Atraxa, it goes away at end of turn, right? But if you Goryo's the Sin and your graveyard is just lands and an Atraxa, you're guaranteed to make a copy of the Atraxa eventually once you've gone through any number of lands, because you get to repeat the process with Sin if you hit a land. So that's kind of cool. We have some ways to discard, like Psychic Frog and Faithless Looting. These are our main ways, alongside Tainted Indulgence, which is draw 2, discard a card. Otherworldly Gaze, 1 mana Surveil 3. So a lot of ways to put cards into the graveyard. We have the reanimation spells, as I mentioned, Goryo's Vengeance. This one's a little hard to read given the poster artwork, but it's 2 mana, return a legendary from your graveyard to the battlefield, give it haste, and then exile it at the end of turn. Along with Emperor of Bones, similar concept. And then instead of Ephemerate that you usually see in the Esper Goryo's decks, we're playing Essence Flux, which is blue, exile a creature, then return it to the battlefield. So some cool ways to set up the whole reanimate angle, and Sin is one that I haven't seen a lot of people play before, but Seems a little interesting. And last up here, I just wanted to show you from JC Spider in 27th place. It's Boros Energy, but if you'll notice, there are some interesting choices in the main deck. There are 4 copies of Crack the Earth and 4 copies of Molten Rain. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but JC Spider, if you're watching this, the Eldrazi decks, they didn't hurt you that bad, did they? All right, anyways, moving on, we are going to transition and take a look at the Pioneer metagame. And here's Pioneer. It's Pioneer. Yep, it's Pioneer. That's the Pioneer I know and love. That's Pioneer for you. Challenges were won by 2 Phoenix, 2 Rakdos Demons, and 1 Boros Hammer. No, that's not a typo. 33% mono red, up from 26 last week. Yeah. Yep. Phoenix from 16 to 17, about the same. Rakdos Demons, slight up to huge, not huge, but slight uptick from 7.5 to 11.9. That's pretty significant. Monument tanked from 8.8 to 2.5. A lot of people are off that Orzhov Monument deck, which is sad because that deck looks really spicy. Celestia Angels staying about the exact same. Golgari Sacrifice, the exact same. Mono Black Midrange, which is essentially nowhere to be found this week, unless I missed it somewhere on here. 3.8 to non-existent this week. It looks like what I'm guessing is a lot of the people that were playing Mono Black last week just switched to Rakdos, because that's about the difference between the percentages. Azorius Control about the same, and nothing too else crazy. I mean, yeah, mono red. And the funny thing about the mono red deck is it is eerily similar to what the mono red decks in Standard look like prior to the banning of Rage and Heartfire Hero, excuse me. Maybe it's time to have a conversation about those cards in Pioneer? Anyways, let's take a look at some deck lists. And as I told you, the Boros Hammer deck was not a typo. The Agent 002, first place in the 713 Pioneer Challenge with Boros Hammer. Ban card alert. I repeat, ban card alert. This one looks pretty cool. It's a very, very clean list. You have some ways to equip for, I guess, quote-unquote free. Sigarda's Aid, which allows you to do it at instant speed. Kazul's Toll Collector, which only allows you to do it at sorcery speed, but you can pay 0 to move an equipment to itself. And then you have Kemba, Ka-Enduring. 2-mana 2/2, when it ETBs, you can attach equipment to a cat you control. Or is it? Yeah, it has to be itself. So, you know, you play the hammer on turn 1, and then you play Kemba on turn 2, and then auto-attach it. You have some tutor targets, I guess, for stuff like Cloud and Kellen the Fey-Blooded, where you have Shadow Spear, 1 Lion Sash, but, I mean, most of the time you're going to be getting Colossus Hammer, especially with 12 ways to attach, 4 Sigarda's Aid, 4 Collector, 4 Kemba. Like, you just want to do the hammer thing as often and as consistent as possible. And this deck certainly does that. So if you're into the sort of Boros Hammer style decks, this is probably a good place to start. Next up here from DB_Optimus Tom, shout out to Optimus Tom here, 32nd place. This is an Abzan Sacrifice deck. I wanted to highlight this one because it has some very, very interesting card choices here. So this is very akin to the sort of black-green collected company sacrifice decks that you may or may not have seen before, that were playing like Catacomb Sifter and Woe Strider, Llanowar Elves, Priest of Forgotten Gods, Collected Company, Tyvar. It's got a very similar vibe to that, and it does have a lot of those cards, right? Woe Strider, as I mentioned, Zulaport Cutthroat, Priest of Forgotten Gods, Llanowar Elves, Elvish Mystic, things like that, and then the Kokos and the Tyvars as well. But we decided to go for a little bit of a white splash here, and I wanted to highlight those cards because those are the main differences here between this and previous versions of the Sacrifice decks. So you get a little extra consistency in the Sacrifice outlet department with Bartolome. You have Extraction Specialist, which is pretty cool because you can sacrifice a 2-drop for some sort of value, and then Specialist get back the 2-drop. Also, Specialist at instant speed off of a Coco is pretty powerful because it's just a good body, 3/2 lifelink. You have not a white card, but Sephiroth Fabled Soldier. Fantastic card in these sort of sacrifice-style decks. And then you get a pretty sizable upgrade in the 2-drop department with both Voice of Resurgence and Voice of Victory. So Abzan Voices, and both of these are very good with sack outlets because they make additional bodies. Voice makes 2/1/1s when it attacks, and then Victory, sorry, makes 2/1/1s when it attacks, and Resurgence makes an elemental when it dies. So overall, clean looking deck list. If you're into the sort of collected company sacrifice style decks, you could be doing a lot worse than this one. Next up from WCL, we have a interesting take on the Abzan Greasefang decks, which have mostly fallen out of favor with regards to Greasefang. More people have been gravitating towards either Orzhov or Mardu as of late over the past couple of weeks, and nobody's really been kind of messing with Abzan. This is the first sort of interesting version of it that I've seen. And so let me go over some of the cards here. So Greasefang, you're probably familiar with this card. It gets a vehicle back. That is what the whole deck is built around. You want to put Parhelion into the graveyard to then reanimate it with haste and attack your opponent for 13 flying damage. So you have some ways to discard Parhelion, Guardian of Nubenalia, and Seasoned Hallowblade. These are functionally similar cards where they're two-drop creatures that allow you to discard a card to give them indestructible, but notably they're just free discard outlets, so you just want to be able to dump cards to get those back. And then you have some other self-mill cards like Dredger's Insight, which is interesting, where this mills 4 and then you get an artifact, creature, or land. It is important that it's artifact or creature. You have Cash Grab, and then you do have enough types to set up a traverse line, seeing you have artifacts, creatures, enchantments, instants, and lands, so Delirium is relatively achievable, and that can go find you the Greasefang. The interesting part here is once you've gotten past all of that stuff, we then also have 4 Monument to Endurance, which is awesome because Greasefang typically has issues against Graveyard Hate Postboard, and Monument is a good way to sidestep that, especially with all these free discard outlets. We have a couple of Gardens to copy, and yeah, very interesting take on the sort of the Greasefang style deck. It's possible that maybe the Monuments should be moved, maybe the Monument should be in the sideboard, and that would be your plan against decks that have a lot of Graveyard Hate, is just board into the Monuments, but either way, an interesting idea, and perhaps something to consider. And we're going to end things off with, I guess, a little bit more Greasefang, little bit more of that rat, the rat pilot, as it were. So this one from Arion, 28th place, is an Esper take on the Greasefang deck. Most notably, the card that I wanted to highlight here is Emmett Selch Unsundered. A lot of these other stuff, like Greasefang, discard outlets, removal spells, Thoughtseize, that stuff, like all, that makes a lot of sense. Emmett Selch, though, is interesting, where this is, again, sort of that plan B, where if your opponent is interacting, I guess Emmett Selch does utilize the graveyard, so it's not quite the same, but if your opponent, say, is it Phoenix, and they're interacting with your Greasefangs a lot with Fiery Impulses and Lightning Axes, maybe Emmett Selch is a good pivot point, because once you transform the Emmet, it basically just gives you a Yawgmoth's Will and lets you replay all of your other cards, and it kind of gets out of control pretty quickly. So just a slightly different take on the Greasefang decks, and if you're into that sort of thing, a couple of different ways to build that, and that's pretty cool. So that's going to be it for Pioneer. Let us get to, I guess, the main event, Standard. And here we are, week number 2, since the bans have occurred and been effective on Magic Online, and this is where we are. Now, I will say, Dimir midrange last week, 28%. That number is down significantly. 28%, now 18.8. Is It Cauldron has gone from 8.3 to 17.7. So it seems like, at least with regards to Magic Online data, those two decks seem to be the two decks to beat right now. And that is sort of playing out in a similar way on Arena. I've been playing a lot more against Dimir and Is It than most of the other decks. You'll see the challenges. There were 6 of them. 3 of them were won by Dimir. 3 of them were won by Is It. 1 Prowess, 2 Cauldron. The Prowess decks are significantly different than the Cauldron decks. They really don't share that many cards, with the exception of the VVs, the Floodmaws, and then sometimes the Prowess decks play 1 or 2 Cauldrons. Every other card is different. It's an entirely different deck. So yes, they play VV, but they play out. One's a lot more aggressive. The Cauldron decks are a lot more aggressive. Boros Convoke from 4.2 to 6.3, a little bit of an uptick there. Here's a big one. Golgari midrange, 3.6 last week to 9.9 this week. And I think that is sort of a natural response to Dimir being a very good deck, because historically, at least in my experience, Dimir players, I'm sure you're going to tell me I'm wrong, but I've always felt that Golgari was pretty good against Dimir. You just have you have better, sort of better late game. You have answers to their Kaidos with Terra Sunder and Shieldred's Edict. It always felt like a pretty good matchup. So I think that might be a natural response to Dimir being a big part of the metagame. Prowess clocking in at 8.9, up a little bit from last week. And then from there, you kind of have the rest of it, I guess, as it were. Mono white tokens, 12.5 last week, 4.2 this week. Pretty noticeable decrease there. Here's another one, mono green aggro. Basically non-existent last week, and then 5.7%. Actually, I should have put this in the beginning. Mono green aggro did win a challenge, and I'm sure people are going to tell me about it in the comments. The reason I didn't include it here is because I include the challenges over the weekend. Mono green won a challenge, I think, on Tuesday or something. So not quite in this data set, but it did win a challenge, and we're going to get into that deck list in a second. So this is the metagame. Enough of me rambling about these deck lists. Let's look at some sweet ones, shall we? And sweet ones we definitely have. Starting off with DSK Beowulf, 19th place. There's actually a different list that top 8'd a challenge, but the person who played this deck and the person who played in the challenges was in my Twitch chat yesterday because I was playing a version of their deck, and they said this was the more updated version. So we'll show you this one. The concept behind this deck is that I guess you're a cloud deck, right? Which is kind of weird because there's only 6 equipments. But the concept here is that Cloud is very powerful with Astrologian's Planisphere, because when you have Planisphere equipped to Cloud, every single time that you play a non-creature spell, you put 2 counters on the Cloud. So what that means is that you go Cloud for Planisphere, and then play the Planisphere plus a 1-mana spell on turn 3, and then turn 4 you can go play your 4th land, equip the Planisphere, play 2 1-mana spells, and now your Cloud's hitting for 6. That powered with Sheltered by Ghosts is massive, because for those of you who don't know, if you have a Cloud that's equipped and you have a Sheltered by Ghosts on it, they have to pay the Ward 2 twice. So they effectively have to pay whatever spell they're casting plus 4 mana to kill the Cloud. So that is pretty powerful. You have some other good interaction like Floodmaw and Pierce, a bunch of cantrips with 4 stock-ups, 4 Storm Chasers to kind of lean into that prowess plan with Planisphere, and then you can also Cloud for removal spells, because Cloud can just go get Assimilation Aegis. So a very interesting and well-built deck list. I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler alert. I didn't have the greatest run with it on stream, so I might not upload that video to YouTube, but we'll see what happens. In any case, though, cool looking deck list, and if you can figure out a way to fix the mana base, you might be onto something here. Speaking of Twitch, shout out to RosieDog88, 16th place in the challenge this past weekend. This is a deck list that I absolutely adore. So initially, the deck list came to me from another user in my chat, Fear Symmetry. They sent me this deck list, and I made a couple of changes. I wanted to try working on it. If the video's not already up, expect a video with this deck in the very near future. But this deck is really sweet. So the concept here is you are a Collector's Cage deck. So you need to get creatures with 3 different powers into play. You can accomplish that by making tokens. Overlord of the Mistmoors, Sanguine Evangelist, Voice of Victory gives you a lot of ways to make a bunch of tokens. Cecil Dark Knight, just an extremely messed up 1-drop, and it's just so powerful in basically any deck that has access to black mana on turn 1. You should play Cecil, and it just gives you more cheap creatures to set up a cage. Another really sick interaction here is one of your cage payoffs happens to be Unholy Annex, which I can't pop up on the screen. Editor, if you want to throw up a little image there. I don't know why it's not showing up here. But Unholy Annex pays you off for having demons. And one of basically the only cheap demons in the format is Demon Wall. But you need ways to put counters on it. And it turns out Collector's Cage is a pretty good way to put counters on things. And then as far as the cage payoffs, you have, what's nice about this is you have 4 Overlord, 4 Annex, 2 Elspeth, as far as cage payoffs are concerned. So you have a higher density of cage payoffs, but also because you're playing 4 Overlord and 4 Annex, you can just cast these cards for 3 and 4 mana, while also being very good payoffs for cage. So Really, really good looking deck list, and would highly recommend checking this one out. I had a ton of fun, and I can't wait for you guys to see the video on this one. And I did mention that mono green aggro deck, and I would be remiss to not show it to you guys here. So this is most of what the lists look like. I believe the one that won the challenge had some bushwhacks in the main deck over, I think, like a couple overprotects and a couple snake skins. But for the most part, the creatures are roughly the same, where you have a little bit of mana acceleration in the form of Llanowar elves, and then a ton of landfall creatures. Bristly Bill, landfall, put a counter on a creature. Mossborn Hydra, landfall, double the number of counters on it. Chocobo, landfall, put a counter on the Chocobo. Tifa, landfall, double Tifa's power. So you have 16 different landfall creatures that all get some sort of benefit when you play an additional land. You have 4 Escape Tunnel and 4 Fable Passage, so you have effectively 8 fetch lands. And then what really ties the room together is Traveling Chocobo. And this card, and I misread it, I'm sure a lot of you guys out there also misread it, it doubles up every landfall trigger, not just from birds. Every single creature that has a landfall trigger will double with the Traveling Chocobo. And it lets you play lands from the top, so if you're missing lands in hand, you can find the lands off the Chocobo to then trigger all your stuff. You have Springbloom Druid, which is a 1/1 for 3 that you can sack a land to go find 2 more lands. It's just a ton of ways to kill your opponent very, very quickly. I believe this deck does have some turn 3 kills available to it, so you better watch out for those birds. They're coming for you. And last but not least, let's go ahead and end things off with some goblins. This is K. Richa 13, 23rd place. Interesting take on the goblins archetype. So a lot of these cards, if you've seen a goblins deck in standard before over the past month or so, you might be familiar with a lot of these cards. You have the 1-drops with Burnout, Cacophony Scamp, and Stadium Headliner. The 2-drops, which make more tokens in the form of Seer Slicer Goblin. You have Horde Master, which pumps all of your goblins. You then have Draconautics Engineer, which can give your stuff haste. Or make a 4/4, which could come up. You then have the 3s, which are 4 Dropkick Bomber. This is something that I don't see a lot of Goblins players playing. They're playing like 1 or 2 maybe. 4 Howl Squad Heavy, which can make more tokens. And then once you have max speed, this thing makes a red mana for every goblin you control. But more importantly, it gives your other goblins haste. So if you have turn 3 Howl Squad Heavy, turn 4 Krenko, you can immediately activate the Krenko. In a similar vein, there's a bit of a weird splash here, and that is for Frostcliff Siege. So Goblin splashing blue because the Frostcliff Siege also gives your creatures +1/+0, trample, and haste. So if you go Frostcliff Siege on turn 3 into Krenko on turn 4, make a bunch of tokens, all of your tokens now have haste, +1/+0, and they can all attack the turn they come into play. Also, blue gives you access to stuff like Spell Pierce and Into the Floodmaw on the sideboard, so some interaction that red didn't have before. Interesting take on the Goblins deck, and I may have to try this one out myself. Alrighty, folks, that is going to put a wrap on another episode of Watching the Meta. Once again, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and we'll do it all again next week, shall we? Until next time, adios.